Hello. Today's lesson focuses on adding and subtracting radicals. All right. So the rule's a lot like it is for variables. You can combine things that are alike. So I can combine a radical 2 with a radical 2. So I have 3 radical 2's and I'm taking away 2 radical 2's. So 3 minus 2 is 1 radical 2. Or I would just write that radical 2. Okay. These are both radical 8's, so we can combine them. We have 5 of these and 2 of these, so we have 7 of those exact same things. But this time, we have to look at this radical. That radical always has to be in simplest form. So we need to simplify this radical 8. So we'll leave the 7 out in front. This is just like problems we did the other day. I can factor 8 to radical 4 times radical 2. Again, I want to start with a perfect square, which is 4. And then I can break this up. Square root of 4, square root of 2. And then simplify. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 2 we can't do. So we have 14 radical 2. Okay? We always have to make sure that what's in the radical sign is as simplified as can be. So let's look at another problem. These are both radical 10's. So I can combine them. I have a 2 minus 5, which is negative 3. Radical 10, and I have to check to make sure. Can I simplify the square root of 10? Can I factor it using a perfect square? And I can't. I can factor it, 5 and 2, but neither of those is a perfect square, so that's not helpful. Okay. Now, sometimes we need to simplify before we can see if we can combine. So for example, the square root of 20. We can't do the square root of 6. That's not a perfect square. And when we factor it, 2 times 3, neither of those are perfect squares. 5, not a perfect square. But 20 we can simplify. So I'm going to bring down the minus 2. I'll bring down everything. Radical 20 I'm going to factor as a radical 4 times a radical 5. So we have a 2 radical 6, we have a minus 3 radical 5, and here when we simplify this, a square root of 4 is 2, so we have 2 times 2 would be 4 radical 5. Okay, so I just brought these first 2 down. Sorry, that's messy. Now we look, we've got some radical 5s we can combine. So there's no radical 6's, so that just stays. And then when we look at these radical 5's, we have a negative 3 and a negative 4, which gives us a negative 7 radical 5. Okay. When we look at number 6 here, we might remember that 27 is the square root of 9 times the square root of 3. And 12 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, right? 9 and 4, each of those are a perfect square, so we can simplify those. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to bring down the 2 radical 5, bring down the minus 2. 27, square root of 27, we could simplify to radical 9 times radical 3, and the square root of 9 is 3, so that's now out of a radical sign. Square root of 3, we can't do, so it stays. Bring down the minus. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 3 we can't do. So let's go through and simplify this again. We've got a negative 2 radical 5. These are both outside the radical sign, so we need to multiply them. So we have a negative 6 radical 3. And bring this down, a negative 2 radical 3. And now we have some like terms here. These both have a radical 3. So we bring down the 2 radical 5. And we have a -6 and a -2, which gives us a -8 radical 3. Here's our next set of questions. So we look at this. We've got 12, which we know, square root of 12 we can factor, and square root of 20 we can factor with perfect squares. So I'm going to do this, bring this down. Square root of 12 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. What's the square root of 4? That's 2. So I have 2 times 2 is 4, radical 3. So I combined a few steps there. I hope that's okay. Square root of 20 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. Again, we always write the perfect square first. The square root of 4 is 2, so that comes outside the radical sign. So we have a -3 times 2 is -6, radical 5. And now we see we've got like terms here, radical 3. So a -3 and a +4 is a -1. We don't need to write the 1. Radical 3. So we did those. -6, radical 5. Again, there's a hidden 1 here, so keep that in mind. There's a hidden piece of information. That's going to come up in a few other problems. All right. 8 and 27, we have factored them before. We have said that 8 is square root of 8 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Bring down the +2. 27 has a perfect square of 9 times 3. Bring down the -3. Radical 3 we can't do anything with. Okay. If we go ahead and simplify, the square root of 4 is 2. So we have 2 times 2, 4, radical 2. Square root of 9 is 3. So we have 2 times 3, +6, radical 3. And nothing to simplify here. Again, we have like terms, so we can combine them. We bring down the first part. And then we add these. We have a +6 and a -3, so that's a +3, radical 3s. Again, these work just like variables. So if I had a 6a minus 3a, we would get 3a. It's just the like term operates sort of like a radical. I mean, a variable does. Okay. So let's take a look here. I filled in the hidden 1 here, so it was just a minus radical 5, but that means -1 times radical 5. These are all radical 5s, so we can combine them. We have a -1, we have a -1 minus 2 minus 2. So -1 minus 2 is -3, -3 minus 2 is -5. So they all add up to -5, radical 5. Again, they're like terms, so we just had to combine their coefficients. All right. Another hidden 1 here in front of the radical 20. When it's a minus, it's technically a -1. Now, these are like, so we could combine these right now to get a -2 radical 20 minus 1 radical 20 is -3 radical 20. And then I'll bring this down. And then, as always, we need to make sure we've simplified the radical as much as can be. And we can factor 20 using a perfect square of 4. Bring this down. Okay, got a -3. The square root of 4 is 2, so it comes out of the radical sign. So we have -6 radical 5 minus 2 radical 2. All right, 2 more examples here. And as always, if you have questions about this, email me. We'll set up a time to talk or to meet, and I can show you. All right. Again, we had a hidden 1 here. So none of these are the same. We can simplify. We've done this a bunch of times. Square root of 8, square root of 12. So let's do that. -1 square root of 8 is the same as radical 4 times radical 2. And then we've got to bring this down, and let's factor 12. Square root of 12 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. So let's do these one at a time. Just simplify here first. Square root of 4 is 2, so these are both outside and they're multiplied. So we have negative 2, radical 2. Bring this one down. Simplify here. The square root of 4 is 2. It's outside of a radical sign. And now we see we have like terms here, so we can combine them. A negative 2 and a negative 2 is a negative 4, radical 2. When we add these, the radical doesn't change. And minus 2, radical 3. All right. Last one. Oh, these are all radical 12s. So they're already like terms. We can combine them. We have a negative 1 and a negative 1, which is negative 2, plus 2, which is 0. And 0 times anything is 0. So there's nothing more for us to do. Okay? If you have questions, let me know. I'm happy to help. Bye.